COVID-19, but if anybody can shed a bit of light, I think it's our two speakers this evening. So let me introduce them in alphabetical order. First, they're both chums of mine, so apart from anything else, it's great just to have a chance to chat with two people that I like a lot and who are terribly clever and will have interesting things to say, I can guarantee. So the first one is Professor Amitav Acharya, and Amitav and I have got one thing in common. We've both got our PhDs from Murdoch, but unlike some of us, Amitav didn't let that hold him back, and he's gone on to greater and grander things ever since. And I'll read out his title for you. Distinguished Professor of International Relations and UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance, School of International Service, American University in Washington, DC. And for those of you who are a bit obsessive, like most academics are, you might want to Google him and check out his citation count. It's quite intimidating. So not that citation counts at everything in life, but they're an awful lot in academia, as we all know. Now, the other person who I'm going to introduce you to tonight is an old friend of mine as well, who used to be at UWA with me, but unfortunately left despite our protestations. And occasionally there are outbursts of weeping and wailing in the corridors when we think about our great loss and how UQ managed to steal her away. But such is life. But anyway, it's my great pleasure to be reunited once again with Sarah Percy, who's now Associate Professor in the School of International Relations at the University of Queensland. And Sarah has published widely on a number of topics in international relations, particularly maritime security and related sorts of issues. So as our little blurb indicates, I've asked Amitav and Sarah to talk about their ideas and thoughts about this enormous, I'll resist the temptation to say unprecedented, because it seems to be impossible to say anything about this topic without saying unprecedented, so I'll try not to, but it is a remarkable set of events that we weren't expecting, and it's pretty hard to know how it's all going to end. Now, my suspicion is it might be in tears, but I'm looking to Amitav and Sarah to cheer me up this evening, and the rest of us, and to give us a few ideas about what they think all of this might mean. So we might start off with Amitav, because he's written particularly about this topic, amongst many others, and has got some interesting ideas and an interesting way of framing the entire debate. So I might hand over to Amitav first. Before I do, let me just say that I've asked Sarah and Amitav to talk for about 10-15 minutes each, and you'll notice on the bottom of your screens there's a chat function, and a Q&A function, and we'd like you to send in questions to direct to Sarah and Amitav, because the second half hour will be Q&A and discussion. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to send them in as we go along. No need to wait till the end, and I'll kind of curate them and pass them on to our speakers. So without further ado, let me hand over to Amitav for a few words of wisdom to get us cracking. Thanks, Amitav.
Thank you, Mark, for organizing this, and thank you, Sarah, for joining me. It's always a pleasure to connect with I guess this is from Perth, and that's where I spent 7 or 6 great years of my life. Very nostalgic about it, and hopefully I'll go back one day if that is ever possible. So what I'm going to talk about is as Mark said, the framing. The framing of my presentation will be based on what I've been writing about before the pandemic, or even before Trump, about the changing world order. And then I'll bring in some of the implications of the coronavirus to it, and try to see what is really new and what is really something that is an acceleration of trends that we already had seen for quite some time, at least for the last decade or so. And first of all, a caveat, I think it's too early to assess what's the actual long-term effects of the pandemic. People use terms like transformation, change of, revolution, and this is all possible. I have also used those terms, but I'm also very careful about making any definitive assessments at this stage, because a lot of things can change. And if you want a little bit of good news, here I was talking to my doctor yesterday by video to get a medical sort of exemption from having to teach in person because my university is trying to force us to, some of us to teach in class. And he said that the evidence he's getting from around Washington, Maryland area is that the virus is becoming less lethal. And the infections and the hospitalizations show that the virus is less lethal. He didn't think a vaccine is possible very quickly, but he does think that probably this virus will go in the way that it is mutating to a less lethal form and people will get used to it. So that's the only good news I have had in the last 5-6 months. But going back to the point that the world order was already changing. And the world order, if we use the shorthand of what people mean by world order, is it's the concept of the liberal international order. That was already changing and declining and in crisis even before Trump got elected. And I think the question now is how far this will be pushed beyond any redemption and how far it can be revived, especially if we have a new American president in November, which is looking increasingly likely. This is another good news, by the way, because this pandemic and the anti-racism riots and the protests in the United States has really undermined Trump quite critically. But going back to how the world order was already changing, I have talked about, there are 4 ways in which the changes were happening. Again, none of this is revolutionarily new. It's a way of bringing together what was a trend that were already evident for some time, some even going back to decades, and some in the last, since 2008, 2009 global financial crisis. The first one was that we have a lot more actors in the world. If we talk about international relations or world order, you have to think first of the actors. So when we talk about actors, we talk about states, we talk about great powers, we talk about middle powers, weak states, but also non-state actors like institutions and social movements, and of course, radical extremist, violent extremist groups. So the world was already becoming very pluralized. I mean, I'm not saying the nation state was disappearing, but certainly it had a lot more competition. And one of the interesting things was that the hegemony of a single nation was becoming passé. Hegemony is always, and this is one of my key points, that hegemony is a very rare thing in international relations, the global hegemony. So we have had Britain for a while and then the United States, but historically we never had really that kind of globally dominant powers. And in that sense, the American global hegemony was already declining, both economically, but in terms of political and diplomatic influence with the rise of new powers, but also because of, it's in a sense, the rise of a whole range of new actors. Nobody seriously had thought that United States could survive in the same way as a global hegemon as it was before the 1970s. And nobody had really thought, certainly not me, that China would just step into the shoes of the United States. That China has so many weaknesses and legitimacy issues that it will be a great power, it will be influential power, but not a globally dominant power. So in this post-hegemonic period, we would have a number of other actors, both state and non-state, including middle powers, including emerging powers, regional powers, and also institutions will have their place, and social movements will have their place. That was the first thing, so multiplicity of actors. And it's very basic, in global governance, but I think it has to be said because we will then talk about how the pandemic might affect it. The second thing that was changing is the nature of interdependence. Interdependence has been traditionally defined very narrowly. 19th century interdependence, the age of classic multipolarity. We had interdependence among the big European countries, but that was mainly based on trade. Interdependence in the 20th century, late 20th century, was becoming much more diverse. It was not just about trade, it was about finance, but most importantly, production networks and supply chains. But we also had interdependence induced by global challenges, like the pandemic, like climate change. This is also part of, these are shared fate issues for nations. So the interdependence was very wider in scope, more global in scope than ever was the case in the 19th, early 20th century, which was a question of a selective interdependence among big European powers and the rest of the world being dependent rather than interdependent with the Europeans. And this is why the idea of multipolarity to me doesn't make sense, because this is nothing like multipolarity that, that happened in the 19th century, and we're not going to go back to that kind of multipolarity. The third element was governance. Global governance was already fragmenting. The United Nations system had been joined by a whole range of institutions, regional institutions, plurilateral ones, and also at different levels. Again, regionalism was becoming important, the governance system was also being led by different types of actors. It was no longer intergovernmental. Global governance was moving away from intergovernmentalism to multi-stakeholderism. And we had, like Paris Climate Agreement, which was basically not, it had a lot of actors involved in making that agreement possible, including the European Union, of course, US and China, but also epistemic or knowledge communities and corporations, and global governance was also becoming a matter of a private-public partnership, a lot of hybrid forms. So that some people call it fragmentation, some people call it pluralization, but it was already changing. The UN and the big multilaterals were no longer the only game in town. And finally, ideology. I mean, this doesn't need to be stressed very much, but certainly, Francis Fukuyama's idea of a liberalism, democracy being the only game in town has been long disproved, almost immediately after he made that thesis. And now, of course, he has backed up from that. So we knew that there will be other types of ideologies, not only a revival of authoritarianism, populism, but also communitarianism, and various blends. Even democracy itself had become much more differentiated. So there is no single ideology in the world, and that sort of adds to this pluralization of world politics. So, so none of this is revolutionary new maybe, but putting it together, I call it this kind of world order, not multipolarity, for the reasons I described. Because multipolarity is led by, it's about distribution of power and material power. And it's, it's a Eurocentric term coming from 19th century, early 20th century. And it talked about a certain type of interdependence at a colonial period. I don't think the world is going to go back to that period, a pandemic or no pandemic. I call it multiplexity as opposed to multipolarity. Because I think distribution of power is only one thing that determines a world order. I think the distribution of power may become multipolar, it's already multipolar, but that's not the only thing that determines the world order. So all these other things I talked about, actors, nature of interdependence, levels of governance, and multiplicity of ideas, multiple modernities, so to speak, make it more multiplex. So we have a wall of diversity, but then some interconnection, quite a bit of interconnectedness, where no single actor dominates, and where there are multiplicity of actors, and where challenges are increasingly transnational. I simply call it multiplex world, is a way of using a metaphor, not a theory. So how is the pandemic going to affect all this? And this is where I will sort of try to use my framework to sort of relate to these effects of the pandemic as we see at this point of time. If you look at the actors, we see the continuation of a post-hegemonic era. What is interesting is that neither US nor China are looking good, because I mean, the United States, because of under Trump, the blatant disregard for global norms, active undermining of a global cooperation, and also in a sense in domestic politics, also moving away from liberal democracy to a much more authoritarian pattern of governance. For China also, despite all its efforts to project itself as a responsible power, contain an effective power in containing the pandemic initially, and providing medical aid to many countries, China doesn't look very good either because of the lack of transparency and the early stages of the pandemic, where separation of information really made the spread of the pandemic easier. I don't know that it could have been totally prevented, controlled, but certainly there is a perception that China could have contained the pandemic if it had been more transparent and also more readily willing to cooperate in providing information to the WHO. Recently, there was a report that WHO tried to pander to China to get more information out as soon as possible because they were getting really frustrated by lack of any information. And the Chinese labs and media got information before actually the WHO got about the virus outbreak in Wuhan. And also lately, Chinese military movements in South China Sea, India-China border, all these things is going to make countries question China. If you look at some of the opinion polls in Southeast Asia, it looks like neither the United States nor the Chinese are favorites. They're actually occupying the lowest rung in terms of the question that could this country be expected to act responsibly in world affairs or do the right thing in world affairs. United States and China come in the bottom, China actually in the bottom, and European Union, Japan actually are more ahead of these powers. So I think that we will not only have a non-hegemonic world, would also have a world in which neither superpower or great big power, the two biggest powers will have trust from the international community, unless, as I said, the Democrats win the election and revive some of the old foreign policy traits of the United States. If you look at, that opens up space for other kinds of powers. If you look at what has happened in the pandemic period, some of the smaller and medium countries are looking better. Australia, just talking to Mark, has done a credible job of containing the virus. New Zealand has done outstandingly, but also South Korea and Taiwan, who are really in the eye of the storm. And their performance is much more credible because they are really very crowded nations and very close to China. And they could have really suffered. But Singapore also has prevented loss of lives, very low mortality. So what is the moral of the story is that governance will become more important than power or bluster, propaganda. And countries that are better able to provide governance in different issue areas will actually have more respect, in my view. Although power is not going to disappear. There could be also a third way that people will move away from the, it's like a little bit like the Cold War, when many developing countries did not want to join either the American or the Soviet camp. And you will see that that might happen, that many countries will decide that they don't want to be pro-US or pro-China, or they don't want to take sides. This was already happening again in Southeast Asia, but this could become in a third way. There's a lot of cooperation emerging now, which doesn't involve either China or the United States. Moving on to interdependence, this is where the real change brought by COVID is, because we see a big disruption of supply chains, and we see also some of this happened because of the US-China trade war that happened before the pandemic, but this is going to undermine faith in globalization. And it will lead to not total deglobalization, but arresting of globalization. This in a sense, vindicates, Trump has said that, it vindicates my strategy of self-reliance, national self-reliance, especially when it comes to vital supply chains. And he thinks supply chains are a joke, some crazy idea. Here's the term crazy idea that, in one of the press briefings recently, that we should really be self-reliant. Now that will undercut globalization. I don't think it will end it. It will create new forms of globalization. It might create more regionalization. Countries will be approximate to each other, will deal with each other more, especially in matters of health. I see new health groups emerging. Maybe Australia and New Zealand, South Pacific will have their own health group, easier quarantine and easier access. Southeast Asia, European Union, maybe North America. This could create disruptions and interdependence. But on the other hand, it kind of proves, ironically, that interdependence matters. Just imagine counterfactually, had the United States and China cooperated as opposed to blaming each other like two quarreling children, the world would have much more confidence in its ability to overcome this pandemic. And there is actually evidence that the lack of cooperation between the US and China made it more likely that both countries suffered more. Such cooperation actually happened during the Ebola or the SARS crisis before, but did not happen during so it kind of proves the point that interdependence actually matters.
Okay.
And if you don't do it, it will be really worse. Okay, last 2 points would be institutions. Again, I mentioned already that we could see more regionalization, more health alliances that will undercut further the authority of the global institutions. And we can talk about it during the Q&A. And finally, in terms of ideas, again, this is boosting authoritarianism quite a bit. Authoritarian states are using quarantine laws and travel restrictions to keep people inside, and also keep, control protests and social movements. We see also recently very absolutely mind-boggling attempt by Trump to bring in the 82nd Airborne Division to Washington, D.C. to patrol the streets. But in other authoritarian countries, you see that this is a boon to authoritarian states. So I think in short term, democracy will be undermined, but not completely. So therefore, I would conclude by saying that we're going to see a bit of a challenge to the liberal order, further undermining of the liberal order. We'll see this pluralization of the world that I was talking about already had started. And the news is not going to be happy, maybe except that over tourism, killing of over tourism will help the climate and the environment and also the global heritage. Thank you.
Small price to pay for it, so that's good. Okay, thanks very much, Amitav. That's great for some bit of scene setting. So, Sarah, would you like to say a few words on this? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I better turn my microphone off before I start talking. Thank you very much for inviting me, Mark, and it's nice to be here with Amitav. And it's nice to beam into Perth, my former hometown. I hope you are all doing well. Goodness knows when we'll actually be able to visit each other in person. So, Mark did give us the very easy question when he asked us to plan this of what does a post-COVID world look like? And I sort of thought that's a classic one that if we could answer that, we all would probably stop being academics and start becoming enormously wealthy. And he's also stolen my joke about the fact that I think the two most overused words in academic commentary on international affairs of 2019 and 2020 are probably unprecedented and also the liberal international order. So I'm not going to dwell on either of those things. Amitav's discussed already, I think, some of the challenges to the liberal international order. So I think one of the ways we can answer this question of what a post-COVID world looks like without getting too much into the business of prediction, because that's very, very tricky, partly because we're still so uncertain about how this particular pandemic is going to play out. I mean, right now things look good in certain parts of the world, and we hope, especially here in Australia, that that's maintained, but I don't think we have any guarantees. So it's very difficult to predict forwards. So I'd like to turn us back a little bit and think about what the world has looked like post other major crises. And one of the challenges of doing this is that, of course, we don't really have any directly analogous pandemics, because the Spanish flu, of course, comes in the context of the total disruption of World War I, which had global ramifications and many, many deaths just on that front. And the war itself, for example, had altered the demographics of a lot of Western European nations substantially. So there are really significant differences which make it hard to turn to that Spanish flu pandemic and say, what lessons can we draw from there? So with those caveats, I mean, I think that I agree with Amitav in that I think what we're going to be seeing is the intensification of some trends that were already bubbling away in the international system. And I think we're very likely to see a couple of new things or more new things appearing as well. So in terms of the intensification of the trends, I think that we will see states really attempting to diversify their trading partners away from China. And I think that's obviously particularly the case for countries like Australia. I think there's a lot of discussion now that was already going around the traps in Canberra about whether or not it's wise to put all of your eggs in the basket of one primary trading partner. I think we're likely to continue to see that. I think one of the challenges we're going to see is significant and continuing American unpredictability. And I think the wavering of US democracy at home is a serious worry. From the outside, as a person with some interest in the US as well, I worry that it's hard to see how any president can repair the current political ruptures in the US. And so whichever way the November election goes, I think we're going to see a US which potentially looks quite different from what we've seen before. So we'll either carry on with the Trump presidency, which is characterized by wild levels of unpredictability in terms of what issues are going to attract his interest, or we will see a Biden presidency, which I presume must be characterized by an inward-locking attention to domestic problems, which are going to have to occupy the attention of the president. And of course, we are dealing with two septuagenarians, and there's a degree of unpredictability in that as well, just because of their ages. So I think American politics watchers would do well to look at vice presidents, perhaps more so than in any other previous election. In terms of so that's where I think we see intensification of some things we've seen bubbling away. I think that we may see some things that maybe we wouldn't have expected prior to the pandemic. And one of the things that I've thought a lot as a half American, half British Canadian living in Australia is I think that we may have hit the pause button a little bit on what looked like a perpetually speeding up globalization, where international travel was more and more accessible, where people moved around to an incredible degree. I think it will take a long time for us to return to the speed of international travel that we had before. And I think that will have interesting effects on how people view the world and how people view each other. I think that what this is going to do to state ambitions is going to be extremely interesting. So lots of states had the ambition of having a louder international voice prior to COVID. But I think what we're seeing now is some of those states will have lost that ambition. They might not have the capacity to have that ambition. We might have some unexpected states seeking to capitalize on this moment of change in world politics. So Amitav has given us the nice version of that, where we have your middle powers who've been quite successful, who are nice, friendly democracies. But I wonder about your less friendly states who maybe don't care about their domestic polities, your Russias, who maybe have the moment where they can act in a different way. They're more unconstrained. So I think that the big international politics development that Amitav talked about a lot, and that I no doubt Mark has some things to share about as well, is the US-China relationship and what's going to happen there. Mark asked us to consider what COVID-19 will do to the US-China relationship. And I'm not going to dwell on this largely because I completely agree with Amitav, actually. I think that neither one of our putative superpowers comes out of COVID-19 looking good at all. And I don't know, it's very hard to forecast what that loss of reputation is going to do to those two countries. I think that the combined weak response in the US with significant internal political disruption makes the US look very different to a lot of its potential allies. In my more worried moments, I think that what's going on here is crisis is very revealing of weakness, isn't it? Like, it's very revealing of people's personal weakness when they're in a crisis, and it's very revealing when we put states through crisis to see how they respond. And in my more worried moments, I do think that the consequences for the American political system may be sufficiently grave that in the long term, it makes it very difficult for the US to compete with China. I mean, there's been a lot of suggestion that maybe that relationship was on the turn anyway, that maybe China was rising in its dominance and the US was declining. And I think that unless the political house gets put into some really significant level of order, I do worry that that may be a permanent swap in terms of international power dominance. Some of you may know that I have had a recent interest in the Cold War, and Mark asked me also to reflect on whether or not this was a new Cold War. And look, I don't think it is. I think at the end of World War II, where we started the origins of the Cold War, we saw such a different political scenario. But most particularly, we saw two powers who really wanted global domination and had the capability to at least try to get it, combined with the fact that there was this series of unresolved issues left over from the war. And I'm not sure that the US currently has the capability to look outwards. I think that, we mentioned just before the audience came in that the US has had over 100,000 deaths, so that's more people than died in World War I. So it's no leap of imagination to think that what we're going to see in the US is a return to isolationism. And there's never been a unified voice in the US anyway about what the correct role for America is on the world stage. And what there was at the origins of the Cold War was a reasonably unique moment in the history of American foreign policy about what America should do, which was to counter the Soviet Union. And I don't think we see that same unity of voice. However, I do see some really interesting parallels, not to the Cold War, but to the end of the Cold War. And by that, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. What strikes me about the events of the 1980s and 1989 in particular is that they were this really profound watershed moment, that there was a sense that everybody had that things were going to change and the change was going to be a dramatic change. But nobody knew exactly how that change was going to happen or what the world looked like post the change. And I think that this moment feels to me very much like that moment. I made a radio series on the Cold War and we interviewed a woman. We didn't end up being able to use the interview, but it was really interesting. She was a German woman who had lived in East Berlin all the way through the communist era. And she said that in East Berlin in the 1980s, nobody expected that the wall was going to come down and that the regime was going to fall. But at the same time, there was a profound, really profound feeling of that something was afoot, that the basic institutions of society were beginning to break down, that things took longer to get done than they had done before, and just this impending sense of significant change. And she was then living in the UK, and she said it was a very similar feeling to the feeling in 2016 before the Brexit referendum, that you were on the cusp of a potentially quite big change. And I do feel like that's kind of where we are now. And of course, the other echo is the role of protest. So what we saw in 1989 was these protests that got bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually did create protests that were undertaken with some level of danger. Protests that in some contexts, i.e. China and Tiananmen Square, were brutally crushed, and protests in other cases which were allowed to flourish and did create major political change. So I think that we are standing on the threshold of major changes in world politics, and we don't know what they're like. And I think I'll conclude just briefly by talking about other historical potential analogies, and then whether or not we can draw any threads of optimism out of this potentially very depressing scenario. So I think that the Spanish flu, as I've said, might be the wrong international crisis to go back to look at. And I don't think the post-war scenario is the right one either. But I think when we look at other major crises, the one that we should all be looking at is actually probably the Great Depression. Especially, I think, once we go over the public health impact, we're going to be even more acutely aware of the economic impact. And what does looking at that tell us about what we may see next? And I think it definitely tells us about a turning inwards and a turning towards isolationism. Of course, we all know that the rise of extreme politics in response to economic shock was a characteristic feature of the 1930s. And something that's very important here in work my colleague Frank Moles has done in particular says the same argument is that populism and extreme political movements often take root in people who are comfortably off, not people who are poor. And there's been some very interesting work done about German politics, looking at the areas which were most pro-Nazi in the election that brought Hitler to power were actually comfortably middle-class areas. So it's not necessarily the most poor that are affected, it's people who can perceive their standard of living changing. And I think, unfortunately, modern social media intensifies a lot of these sorts of behaviors. So turning towards isolationism, we've got the role of conspiracy theory is taking on a worrying importance in contemporary international politics. And I think that the previous extremists would have loved to have the social media capacity that we have now. And I do think that's something politically we need to think about quite hard. So am I awake at night worrying? Well, I am an optimist, so I try not to be awake at night worrying. And I do think that one of the things that I've been reflecting a lot is that human ingenuity is pretty good in a crisis. And I bet if you ask people in a range of scenarios, people living anywhere between Germany and the USSR in 1945 as to whether or not their world had ended, they probably would have said yes. And yet it didn't. And we managed to pull ourselves out. Of course, multilateralism and leadership have been our touchstones in terms of pulling ourselves out of major crises in the 20th century. And that's where we are facing a potentially difficult situation. So amid my optimism of we've gone out before, the fact is someone has to be able to take that leadership role, and it's not clear who that's going to be. So China might be keen to do it, but it's an authoritarian state, and do we want it to? The US is politically, domestically a basket case. The UK squandered its leadership abilities, and in doing that has also potentially squandered the EU's leadership abilities. So we're not looking at a scenario where there's any obvious leaders. But yeah, that takes me to the end of what I wanted to say. So I'll turn it back to you, Mark.
Okay, thanks very much, sir. That was great. Now, before I open it up to other people's questions, we've just got a couple of quick ones I want to throw at both of you. One's about the historical context that you both touched on, and one's about the points that Sarah's making about kind of where we are now. So let me just run the first one past you, which is the kind of historical context one. Some people have said what we're seeing about the descriptions of American decline, we're focusing, it's misleading to look at what's going on under Trump because it's an aberration, and we'll go back to business as usual. And we've been through the whole thing about American decline debate before in the 1980s when everybody thought that Japan was going to take over the world and blah, blah, blah. So there's one thing about that. And the other question is, are our expectations about what the United States could and should do unrealistically high? Because everybody's saying China was terrible and they were covering up. But the reality is that, maybe rightly, we have higher expectations about how the United States ought to behave as a world actor in a way that we don't have about China, who 30 years ago was still a pretty ho-hum agrarian economy in the middle of nowhere. So there's that's the first twofold question. So brief responses about the historical dimension and about expectations about the United States behavior. I don't know who wants to go first. Amitav?
So I can take one of them at least, and the first one, when you talk about American decline, and I personally never said the United States is declining, except in a very relative sense. What I said is that the American built world order is declining. So there's a big difference between talking about the decline of the United States as a power and the decline of the American built world order, which is, some people call it the liberal order. And this is a very important distinction that people sometimes miss. So when I wrote about the end of American world order in 2014, it was about the order, not about the power of the United States. And we don't know whether the United States will really decline or might find opportunity. As I was telling you, the United States has a very large economy, still has the dollar is rising, strengthening out of this crisis. But what has happened is America has lost the ability or even willingness under Trump to shape world order, manage world order. And that is why we are having even more of a pessimistic outcome out of this COVID-19 that might have been. With more global cooperation, more leadership, at least it would have been had a more psychological, more positive psychological impact on countries in responding to the COVID. So, and what Trump has done is taken the United States out of the leadership position, even though he's making America great again in terms of power. And I think this is the contradiction. And I'll leave Shara to answer the other question about what is expectations of the United States. I'm very interested to hear her views because.
Before you do, Sarah, can I just add a little bit onto this, because I'm conscious that there are Q questions as well. I don't want to discussion. So let me just tack on my second question that I was going to, which flows from the point you were making about a particular historical moment and the fluidity of the particular moment. I don't know if you've read Katzenstein's book about protean power and the idea that there are certain moments in history where things could go in different directions. Arguably, we're at one of those kind of moments now. So, I mean, I guess the question is, what do you think might decide which way things go, and what kind of, because Amitav's laid out a whole series of potential actors that might have more influence and more say in what goes on. So do you have any strong feeling about what might be decisive in turning one thing one way or another?
I wish I did, because then I would sound so amazingly informed and authoritative. But I think that the very nature of this type of political situation is that they are fluid and unpredictable, and it's very hard to know where things are going to go. And I mean, one of the things that has really struck me doing the historical work I've been doing recently is just the role of luck is so important in understanding what happens in major international political events, where it literally is just sometimes a stroke of luck in one direction or another that makes world politics turn around. And I think that in answer to the other question about American decline and whether or not our expectations of America are unreasonable, look, I agree with everything that Amitav just said on the decline point. And of course, one of my favorite things to do with my students sometimes is to show them various articles that have been written about American decline in different chunks of time and ask about what's different. But I don't think any of us ever imagined we'd be sitting in a world where the president advocated injecting yourself with bleach as a serious public health solution. So we are operating in different parameters with the American polity. And I do think that remember how I said I think crisis is very revealing of what a country's political system is like. And I think that it revealed an enormous amount about what everybody feared was true with China, which is that it's fundamentally deeply authoritarian and not interested in telling the truth about things that will embarrass it on the international stage. And in the US, what it revealed is a political system which is deeply flawed, and a public health system which is deeply flawed, and not a lot of will or ability to fix it. And I know in the Q&A that somebody's asked about the connection between Black Lives Matter and COVID on the international stage. And I think that there's a very clear connection in the US in particular, because what we're seeing now is people who do not trust the political system from all sides of politics, whether or not that's on the right, on the left, among conspiracy theorists who think we should be pulling down 5G towers instead of statues. It's showed up some very profound distrust. So I think that that's part of the striking aspect of what's happening in the US at the moment.
So just to pick up that question from you, Tao, one of my colleagues at UWA, who you may or may not know. Do you want to comment on that, Amitav? Because the question's about, and this picks up on what Sarah was saying as well, about the surprising fragility of America's domestic political scene at the moment. You're there, you're living in it. Do you get the sense that us, the rest of us looking at America, see a place that seems to be unraveling and having really deep-seated problems, and some of the fabled checks and balances that we all expected to stabilize American social and political life don't seem to be working too well? Is that your kind of sense as well?
First of all, I have not participating in the demonstration. I'm hiding. I mean, we have had demonstrations in, I live in a suburban area, but even our nearby small town, Bethesda, which is part of the Greater Washington area, had demonstrations. But I think I will connect this with this whole idea for the Black Lives Matter. There was another question, and a pandemic going parallel. There is no question that this is the American political system at its worst. But I always believed that the United States had a very bad political system. I think it was built to create chaos and instability. The so-called checks and balances was not dysfunctional. I actually think the parliamentary system works better. So there you go. Australia, I grew up in India. And I don't think a British leader who was like Trump would have lasted very long in that kind of stupidity and toxicity and racism, misogynism, everything. So the American presidential system is a very imperial system, and I really don't. American Supreme Court is hugely politicized. They're political appointees, by the way. They take political positions. So I've never been a big fan of the American domestic political system, and it's not able. America was very lucky because the political system helped it to, it was rising. But it's not a good system to have faith in when there's a crisis and even catastrophe in some ways. And I think the perception of America in unraveling is very real, even within the United States. But people do think that a political change, this is a very unusual moment in that sense. Trump is so extreme in so many respects. I wrote a book criticizing George W. Bush called Age of Fear on War on Terror. I love George W. Bush now. I would hug him if I could. I mean, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And on the question of Black Lives Matter and pandemic, there was another question. I think those are separate developments, but one feeds into the other. The anti-racist protests are actually feeds into the anger that people already had about being confined to home, and also the lack of a very effective response from the Trump administration to the pandemic. But I am not optimistic that this will be very transformational. The protests are petered out. The basic issues about racism, structural racism, remain. And so what we're looking at is police reform or defunding police. That's important, but that's the structural factors that leads to things like the disproportionate number of COVID victims are actually Blacks. The inequality, nothing has happened to change that. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I think racism is much more deep-rooted and structural. At least it'll be good to say a recognition and people coming out and protesting. It's very uplifting. But I am not very optimistic that this will lead to a very fundamental change in race relations in this country.
It's kind of interesting that people are seriously suggesting that George Bush, by comparison, isn't that bad. But in Trump's defense, he hasn't started a war in the Middle East yet, but that may happen yet. So there's a kind of question that partly bears on this, and this is from Professor John Kwa, who I think some of you might know. And he's asking about, despite all the rhetoric about the rules-based international order and international liberalism and the likes of Eikenberry, et cetera, that Trump is a kind of pursuing a fairly sort of bog standard realist foreign policy. And some people, I don't know if you read the article by Randall Schweller in Foreign Affairs a few issues back, but he was arguing in support of Trump and saying that basically Trump's got a shrewder idea about how to pursue America's quote unquote national interests than anybody else, and kind of good luck to him. So do you see this as that maybe Trump's, in some respects, this is just a question, has had a bit of a bad press, and beneath all of the kind of unfortunate rhetoric, that it's kind of business as usual as far as American foreign policy is concerned in some ways?
Well, let Sarah answer that question, but one thing about Randy Schweller, he is a Trump supporter from day one. Yeah. So, as a good friend of mine, by the way, we edit one of the book series together. But I will be interested in hearing Sarah's comments on this, actually.
Sarah.
Look, I think that Amitav distracted me with the Randy Schweller comment because I didn't know that. But look, I think that there's obviously a tradition in American foreign policy of isolationism. We all know this, and that tradition is quite nuanced, right? Like, so the type of isolationist that America has been has varied over time. The thing, if you look at Trump's foreign policy, is that it's wildly inconsistent. So at some moments, it's deeply interventionist and looks like Trump is going to get himself involved in an area where the US hadn't previously been involved, or in an area in which American politics had been settled. So for example, American policy towards Iran, had been reasonably settled, and yet Trump changes it. And the same thing with North Korea. So you have this situation where he's neither one thing nor another because he is so wildly inconsistent. And I think that's probably the big difference, that it's hard for me to say this is somebody just behaving like a very, very pragmatic realist who's looking at the international world in this extremely prudent kind of way. I just see somebody who has whims and pursues the whims, and pursuit of whim is not a great foreign policy, not a great foreign policy tradition.
But it makes a difference, because this is, for those of us who study international politics on a sort of professional basis, it's a pretty interesting and important question about whether leaders actually matter, because Amitav was suggesting that Trump wouldn't have survived in a sort of parliamentary system, but Boris Johnson is not really the epitome of great international statesmanship and leadership or whatever. So, I mean, the question, I guess, is whether there's something more fundamental being revealed in this crisis about the nature of different political systems and their ability to be able to maintain stability, to cope with unexpected crises. And by all of those measures, America's not looking too good, is it really?
I mean,
So is it a fault of the, to put it more dramatic, is it a fault of the system in America, or is Trump just a sort of symptomatic of a longer process of political decline in America rather than economic?
Well, I'm going to pass that one, my turn to pass that one back to Amitav, especially because he's the American in the Zoom room. But I think that it is, the American political system has had a lot of flaws, which have become more and more apparent from the 1960s onwards, actually, and a lot of them are design flaws. I mean, one of the debates that I've been having with a colleague in the school at UQ is, Edmund Burke, he called it. He said, you can't just design political systems out of nothing, because if they don't organically grow, then you think you're going to get it right, and what you do is you get it wrong. And I think the framers of the Constitution never imagined that all of these checks and balances they would put into place would create an imperial presidency and would create a situation where it's very easy to manipulate the political system. And my last thing that I'll say before I pass it over is that before I moved to Australia, I used to think compulsory voting was mad. And I have to say, the last 5 or 6 years have demonstrated the thing when you have compulsory voting is you cannot disenfranchise people. And what the scenario that you see in the US of incredibly low voter turnout combined with actual suppression of the vote couldn't occur if they had either compulsory voting or an independent electoral commission, or ideally both of those things. And that is one of the big challenges of the political system, is that it's very hard for voices to be accurately captured.
All right, I'll briefly answer that last question, but also take up another question that was raised about which pandemic we can compare this one with. But I actually agree. The framers of American Constitution, so-called founding fathers, did not imagine the complexity of the world, which is quite normal. I mean, you can't expect them to imagine. But what is really interesting, some of the worst debates we have had in the United States goes back to the originalism, as some of the Supreme Court judges, the guy Scalia who died said, he was an originalist because the gun control is not acceptable, because it's now our founding fathers said guns are important. Well, guns are important when you are in the wilderness. Guns are not important now. So this tendency so I think it's good to have a more or no constitution in some ways and rely on convention, like the British Constitution in some ways. But I continue to believe that the United States political system was lucky at it, because it survived because of the rise of the United States, and it may not be so good at a time of crisis. Having said that, elections are important. I mean, I was telling this to some friends in China yesterday. In a democracy, it's much easier to change your government. So we could actually see a very different government in November. In China, I was telling them it's very difficult to change. We know that the current Chinese presidency is very different from Deng Xiaoping, who did not want to be so assertive or even aggressive towards the neighbors. But it's very difficult for a Chinese to change their government. So there is one good thing about democracies. You actually change. Governments will change. Governments will change in India. Governments will change in Australia. So this is why I still continue to have faith in real democracies. and maybe it's a personal bias towards me. And again, I lived in Australia, Canada. I'm Canadian, educated in Australia, lived in UK, born in India. So I personally have a bias towards it, or some kind of a mix towards democracy. But the United system is still not a bad system, but it's not as effective and efficient as you think. For Acharya wrote about it. It's not a very effective system, but it is a acceptable democratic system, better than anything else. Okay. Now, there was a question about how can we compare this pandemic to any previous pandemics, and are we living in a pandemic?
Before you do, Amitav, can I add a little bit to this? We'll have to make this the last question, but it's an interesting one. You both might want to say something about this. You just add it to your comments. It's from Alan Peterson, one of our former colleagues from Murdoch, but he's asking about to what extent does the character of pandemics, which look like they're going to be around forever in some ways, because one of the kind of things that's happening is we are reshaping the environment. They don't call it the Anthropocene for nothing. So to kind of caricature his question a little bit and to throw this to you again, is there something about the nature of the way that we've organized ourselves and the impact we're having on the natural environment that means we're going to have to live with this? And the thrust of Alan's question is that therefore going to shape the way that we behave and the way that we organize our political systems and think about the world? That's a big question, but briefly, you might just want to have a quick response or thoughts off the top of your head. So Amitav, you were talking about.
So this pandemic was a known unknown. I mean, pandemics have been predicted. I mean, we know that vast majority of pandemics come out of animals. Bill Gates made a video predicting the next pandemic. In 2003, if you go to New York Times website and Google me, you'll find an article that says pandemics and financial crisis are going to stay, and they're going to reshape world order, because that was after the SARS crisis. What is really astounding is how little the world was prepared for. I mean, how complacent we are. So we hope that this pandemic will not make us complacent anymore, and that we will be prepared to live with this for a very long time. This is not going to go away. So we are living in a post-COVID age is probably not the right way to put it. So maybe pandemic age. It goes with the way we conduct our business and the world we live in. But it may have some good effects. I think it will have decarbonization, which to me is a good thing. Moving people away from big cities, over tourism, which impacts on the climate. It may lead to revival of some manufacturing, less reliance on services, which are like travel and tourism. We don't know that, but this brings me back to the question about how we can compare this with any previous pandemics. I mean, Sarah talked about the Great Depression, and I think that's a good metaphor. But I actually, if you look at my article in National Interest, I talk about the plague in the 14th century. Which also would have started in China, although there's some debate. It might have actually started even in Hubei, and killed something between 40% of the people in China, reduced the world's population by 100 million. It traveled by the Silk Road, which was then the globalization, the instrument of globalization. The Mongol Empire had connected Europe and Asia, Northern Europe, Southern Middle East, Eastern Asia, and Europe in a way that no other empire had. So it was a globalized empire, the foundation of globalization. And the bacteria that caused the plague traveled in the Silk Road. It disrupted the Mongol Empire, the connectivity between the four segments of the Mongol Empire. One of the effects was that it actually helped Europe in many ways. Even though Europe had a lot of suffering in places like Venice and all, but Europe was less affected than Asia. And some people might say, depopulation of Europe, a very congested Europe, actually led to, facilitated in 100 years or so, the rise of Europe. Now, I don't know how, but there is actually good literature on this.
Yes, yeah.
And I see this as a similar disruption of globalization. In this case, may not help Europe, it might help Asia, because Asia generally has so far done better. I mean, I don't want to sound like a champion of Asia, but it's something to look about. And on final point on the age of uncertainty, again, I completely agree with Sarah that we should look at the post-Cold War moment, immediate end of the Cold War moment. with one exception is that there was a little more optimism than there is now. We are really so pessimistic, which is, so your point is a good one, that let's not be so pessimistic. Something good might have come out of this. And I, for one, would be very happy not to see billions of tourists moving around everywhere. And I'm actually happy not to have traveled. And this is the longest I haven't traveled since I went to Perth in 1983.
Yeah. Sarah, you can have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the history of pandemic is an interesting one. And one of the things I wanted to say is that one of my hopes for what we do with this next is that the gods have smiled on us by giving us a reasonably non-fatal pandemic this time round. And I dread to think actually what would have happened if we'd had the level of fatality of Spanish flu, because what this pandemic has demonstrated is that despite the repeated warnings of everyone, that we are woefully unprepared for a pandemic, and of this sort of any type of magnitude greater than the one we have now. So hopefully we will realize and make necessary changes. And one of those changes, I think, must be prioritizing public health, which in turn for me is about prioritizing poverty, because of course what we see, all of the morbidity calculations that come out of various countries showing that minority groups are disproportionately affected by COVID, that's a function of poverty as much as anything else. And so that's something that I think governments need to urgently look at. In terms of whether or not we're living in an era of pandemics, I mean, I don't think scientifically we're in an era where pandemic is any more or any less likely. And I think one of the interesting things about previous pandemics is that they showed that to a degree the world was always globalized, even in a period of time when we think that it isn't. What surprised me slightly about this one is that governments have been reasonably efficient at closing down their borders at a speed with which certainly surprised a lot of people in the early days of the pandemic. But the intensity and the depth of international travel, 3,000 or 4,000 people on a cruise ship sharing their germs, all of these things I think are things that we are going to look back on and think we're crazy. And I think that we hopefully will see a moment where the solution to this problem is to think about how you make your political system more robust, how you make your public health system more robust. And that's where hopefully we'll see the leadership. I don't know whether or not we're going to, but perhaps that's what we should all be doing, is pressing for that kind of change.
Indeed, indeed. I could talk about this all night, I have to say, but unfortunately we have run out of time. We're a bit over time, in fact. But many, many thanks indeed for that. That was fantastic, really interesting, really stimulating. Lots more we could say and talk about, but unfortunately we have run out of time. But I do, on behalf of everybody listening and watching, and apologies for not getting through to everybody's questions, but it was great, really interesting, and very good call. And we've recorded this, and with your permission, we shall post it for the millions to feast upon for years to come, no doubt. But no, it was great, really appreciate it. And just a quick plug for the next one in a few weeks' time is going to be on India and China. So no doubt that will stimulate a bit of discussion and things. But thanks again to both of you, and thanks for the audience for turning up and asking such interesting questions. And apologies again for not getting through to all of them. But stay safe, as we say these days. So and thanks again.
Bye.
Look forward to catching
Thank you, everybody.
See you later.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.